I'm Katherine Zimmerman. I'm a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and I just wanted to focus my remarks briefly today on the development with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in the Sahel, particularly focusing on the Al-Qaeda elements since they are so deeply entrenched in the region. I want to look first at where we are today, how we got there, and then a little bit about the conditions going forward as we're looking at some of the issues related to religious freedom and what might hinder progress against it. So what do we have inside of the Sahel, particularly inside of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso? The group Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam al-Mujahideen, which I will call JNIM for short, since it rolls off the tongue much easier that way, is Al-Qaeda's umbrella group inside of the Sahel. It has knit together fundamentally four different pre-existing organizations that are operative in different areas of the region. These include Ansar ad-Din, the Messina Liberation Front, Amr Batun, and then a brigade that was linked to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. But fundamentally, what JNIM has done is stitch together organizations that share a very radical fundamentalist vision for the Sahel and have their bases within different ethnic identity groups inside of the region, which means that the organizations can tap into Arab communities, Tuareg communities, as well as the Fulani communities in general. They, of course, are pulling on different ethnicities as well. But when you look at how these groups have expanded, it's been through identity politics. The laydown of JNIM inside of the Sahel, it has expanded significantly within Mali over the past 10 years, 10, 11 years, looking at the precursor organizations as well, with strongholds in the Timbuktu region and down through central Mali, and significant expansion in the past year or so that is raising alarm for analysts down through southern Mali and toward the western border, which is pushing against Mauritania and some of the coastal West African states on the west, as well as pushing down from Mali into Burkina Faso and into the littoral states, the coastal West African states, so Benin, Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana as well, and a concentration of activity in the tri-border region between Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. The kind of interesting dynamic within the Sahel that we're watching today is the rapid expansion as well of the Islamic State in the Sahel, which had split off from the Al-Qaeda group back in 2015 and had remained somewhat of a threat, particularly based out of the tri-border region, concentrating in Niger. Its leadership was the focus for a time of French counterterrorism operations, which actually did a phenomenal temporary job of disrupting its activities. But as we see counterterrorism pressure lifted, as the group has been able to reconstitute, it's been able to expand into eastern Mali, where Al-Qaeda had previously been operating. I'm actually going to leave that to Aaron Zellen, since he just published a phenomenal report outlining how the Islamic State was working in eastern Mali and seizing some of that territory. But if we're looking at this laydown inside of the Sahel, where we have kind of a significant presence with actual popular support, there is growing concern about whether JNIM in particular will move toward consolidating governance in the Sahel, what that will look like for the people of the region, what that means for the states. And of course, as we're well aware, we've had a series of coups which have limited the ability of the United States and other partners to work with the government in the region. But how did we get here? I think it behooves us just to state upfront that there were governance challenges within the Sahel. It's an incredibly, parts of it are incredibly austere region with the peripheries outside of the state capital, traditionally being marginalized and actually not under direct control of the government. So this is not something that is new in the region, but what has happened has been, there was an intentional strategic effort by Al-Qaeda that began in the 2000s, so long before today, to develop relationships that touched into different networks. And so when the Tuareg rebellion set off in 2012 inside of Mali, following the unrest of 2011 in North Africa, Al-Qaeda was primed to seize advantage of this opportunity, and it did. It moved to expand with Ansar-Din through a key figure, Eid al-Ghali, who serves as both a tribal elder. He was a hostage negotiator for Al-Qaeda, but really important is that he is a fundamentalist believer in what AQIM, Al-Qaeda, has put forward. And because of his role with his community, he's actually transformed their power structure and brought them into kind of a more dominant position within the region, which has meant that he actually has retained influence, even as he's advanced these Al-Qaeda aims. The conflict in Mali expanded southward, and then eventually expanded eastward into Burkina Faso and Niger. And I'm not going to go through those in depth, but looking at how Al-Qaeda was able to do that over the past 10 years, it was using various networks and identity politics, where it was playing on familial networks. It was instigating, in some cases, local conflicts, and so that it was able to come in as a defender of a community and effectively negotiate its way into some level of authority through reconciliation pacts. And I think one of the most interesting developments was that as the conflict theaters expanded, it used the opportunities of somewhat local foreign fighters, right? So fighters from areas in other parts of Mali or in Burkina Faso to vet individuals, to identify charismatic people that it could then basically invest in as they go home to their own community. And they were the ones that sparked the next round of conflict, so intentionally spreading it southward. What we're seeing is that strategic use of violence to really undermine the resilience of local communities, to weaken traditional authorities, and then to begin to replace it with individuals that JNM, or I tend to call it Al-Qaeda, has really invested in and sought to raise and elevate the ranks. The whole point of this is that JNM does not perceive itself as a terrorist organization. That is, of course, how we look at it. But it seeks to transform the lives of Muslims living under its control, and to bring about, it presents this utopian vision, harkening back to a caliphate, the Messina Caliphate, that was live in the 1800s in the region. And when the Fulani people were in power and were not marginalized, you can kind of see how it's trying to sell this vision to communities that have, felt that they lost power under the colonial period, that they continue to be out of power in the post-colonial period, and who are looking at whatever social contract they had previously agreed to and seeing it undermined because the services never reached their part of the state. So the big question then, just to keep this quite short, is where we go. We have 3 coups, which is really limited what the United States can do. There is youth support for the pushist regimes in the various states, but folk that I've talked to discuss this youth support as not support for the coup leaders themselves, but for this idea of change, this transitionary government that may herald in something new. And what that has actually created, if you look at Mali, for example, right, you have some youth supporting the junta in Bamako, and then you have other communities supporting JNM. And right, they may not buy into the fundamentalist vision that it puts forward, but JNIM is advancing their ability to gain as communities. So, the dynamics that we see today are violent crackdowns from the security forces, both against opposition figures and also conducting counterterrorism. Each of the coup leaders came to power talking about the instability generated by JNIM and the Islamic State inside of this region. And so they are trying to demonstrate that they're doing counterterrorism. In Mali, that's the Malian army, along with the Wagner group. And if you've read the news at all over the past few years, you know that the massacres of civilians have gone up. There's been significant human rights violations on both sides. And fundamentally, what we're looking at is a more oppressive central government, which has closed the opposition space and interestingly empowered then some of the religious figures within JNIM who are the only ones willing to speak up against the state. So Ahmed Diko, who's the leader inside of the Messina Liberation Front, has kind of put forward his voice as an opposition figure. And, that is creating this tension then between choices of you're either looking at the junta and support for what they're doing, or you end up backing what JNIM is putting forward, really dividing the country. I think the last element to really highlight here as we're looking at the dynamics inside of the region is that the mechanisms by which JNIM is controlling and advancing its own aims are very different from the Islamic State. And this is something that analysts have argued at length over, is whether JNIM actually controls territory and what type of influence it has. But when you study how this organization has transformed parts of Mali in particular, the anecdotes that come back from various communities is that their way of life has changed slightly, where traditional clothing has been exchanged for more conservative dress that is accepted by Ansar al-Islam, the Messina Liberation Front, which has influence in central Mali. And there is kind of this shadow governance element where individuals understand the left and right and how they're supposed to live their life per the influence of JNIM militias. And they know that if they step outside of those lanes, that there will be some measure of violence against them. So JNIM is using the threat, a coercive threat of violence, in order to bring these communities into what it describes as a Muslim life. Though, of course, if you had surveyed any of them prior to the arrival of JNIM, they would have described themselves as being Muslim. And then the last element of this is, as we are watching these groups expand, they're continuing to play that identity politics game. And it's incredibly important to emphasize that, they're doing it within kind of intra-Muslim conflict, playing those identities, as well as between religions. So there is an active ongoing conflict in Mali between the Fulani and the Dogon, and that has been a long-standing conflict in flame. But it's layered on top of this religious element, where some of the Dogon still practice traditional religion and are not actually Muslim, or what we would commonly define as Muslim. And then, the same thing has happened in Burkina Faso, where their population is, I think, it's about 20% Christian. And we've seen elements from Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State target Christian communities and force them to leave their villages, but also target collaborators with the idea that if Muslim neighbors help their Christian neighbors as well in their new hardship, those Muslims are targeted. So there's this idea of eliminating the gray space between being a supporter for JNIM or this future caliphate, the return of an Islamic state, and those who are accepting of a colonialist vision for the Sahel. And so I think with that, I'll leave it there and turn it over, I believe, to Aaron Bowen, who will follow me.